So, um, what exactly is moral responsibility and intention? So people have been talking about these things for thousands of years. It's rather daunting. I went to the library to, sort of to try to, if I'm going to do research in this stuff, I should learn about it. And I see literally shelves full of books that talk, with intention and moral responsibility in the title. I mean, there are probably lots of others that don't even have it in the title. But Amazon lists 50 books in philosophy, law, and psychology with the term moral responsibility in the title. Actually, I got to 50 and then I stopped counting. I didn't get past the first 10 screens or so. And there are dozens of other books in intention. The Cornell Library at Cornell has shelves full of these books. There's thousands of papers and journals. But there are very, very few papers and books that actually provide formal definitions. Now, why do I care? Well, okay, so I care because I'm a mathematician and we're used to providing formal definitions, but I'm also a computer science. My primary appointment is the computer science department at Cornell. And as you no doubt know, we're building things like autonomous cars. These cars are going to have to make decisions that have a certain moral content to them. Think of them as ethical decisions. We're going to have to write code, algorithms, that, so to speak, tell them how to make these decisions. For that, we're going to need formal definitions. And what I read in these philosophy books, by and large, is not what I would call a formal definition, not something I can write an algorithm using. Okay, so I'm looking for formal definitions. And when I read papers in the philosophy literature, I'm actually used to reading papers in philosophy literature, because before this I did what philosophers call epistemic logic, what I know that you know that I know that you know, kind of stuff that actually is relevant to computer science, believe it or not. I would read these philosophy papers that had informal discussions, and they all presumed we had, their job, they assumed we understood what the word knowledge meant, and their job was just to clarify our intuitions under the assumption everybody understood, and there was a right definition they were trying to elucidate. And that's the sense that I get here, but when I read these papers, the definition seems to change from paragraph to paragraph. Now, I can't point to where it's changing because there is no formal definition, but my sense is when I read these papers that the definition is changing, which makes it frustrating for me. So I say, why do we care? So we're building autonomous agents. That's really going on now in computer science, that we'll need to make what I think can be viewed as moral judgments. Germany recently proposed a code for driverless cars. The proposal specified, among other things, that a driverless car should always opt for property damage over personal injury. So if the car has a choice between harming a passenger or causing damage, it should cause the damage. That's what the code, the legal code of Germany, the proposed legal code of Germany is going to say, or I might say, well, suppose the probability of $100,000 of property damage is 0.999, and the probability of a minor injury is 0.001. Don't ask me where these probabilities come from, and for now, let's accept these are somehow realistic numbers. Is that now reasonable? Should we still go for the property damage over the injury? By the way, how many people cross the street sometimes when it's a red light around the university? What is the probability of getting run over? It's not zero. We make decisions even though there's a possibility of risk and harm to humans. Insurance policy actually try to price that risk. So for those of you who read science fiction as kids, as I certainly did, you'll know that Isaac Asimov wrote all these books on robotics, and he proposed 3 laws of robotics. They're still getting a lot of currency now. Things like a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human to come to harm, and a robot must obey orders given to by a human unless they come into conflict with the first law, and a robot must protect its own existence as such protection as long as such protection doesn't conflict with the first or second laws. You can imagine that applying to an autonomous vehicle. Think of that as a robot. It's actually not very far removed. Now the trouble with this is it's not very precise. It's not always clear how to apply these laws. Now Asimov wrote lots of short stories using these 3 laws. They're actually a lot of fun to read. And the whole point of these stories were these laws were coming into conflict. And there was a situation where the robot had to sort of figure out, did it go with the first law or maybe violate it a little bit to get to the second law. So the point is that because the laws weren't precise, not precise in the sense of a formal mathematical definition, there was a lot of play to figure out exactly how to implement the laws in particular situations. For For example, things like, what if preventing harm to one person causes harm to another? Now, the robot says you may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm, but now you have a choice of doing action A or B. Doing A will harm one person and doing with some probability perhaps, and doing B will harm another. What do you do? Right? What if it's 3 people versus 1 person? Right? These are the things we have to confront. So we need to think in terms of trade-offs. We're building now, this is really happening, assistants, what are called assistive agents that are going to help in nursing homes. This is a big deal now, particularly in Japan, where they have a very rapidly aging population and not enough people to take care of them, not enough younger people to take care of them. So they're building robots. There's a lot of research in building robots that will work in nursing homes. And my guess is what we're talking about over the next 10 years, these robots will become more and more active in nursing homes. Well, should an assistive robot help an elderly patient commit suicide? Right? These are moral decisions, clearly. How do we decide? So that's the background. That's where I'm coming from. And by the way, later Asimov introduces zeroth law that said a robot may not harm humanity or by an action allow humanity to come to harm, taking a broader view. This has become a big deal recently in the philosophy literature. Nick Bostrom wrote a book that talked about superintelligence and the concern that one day the robots will take over, the super AI will take over, which is actually not a totally unrealistic concern. And now we're talking not at the level of allowing an individual to come to harm. We really are talking at the level of humanity. So these are all issues that are going to arise, which I'm not going to say much about in this talk, but think of that as the background to the talk. Okay, how many people have not heard the trolley problem before? How many hands? Okay, well, let me review it. I know you've all heard it, but so this is the kind of problem that's supposed to show the difficulties in coming up with a theory of moral responsibility. So suppose that a runaway trolley is heading down the tracks. There are 5 people tied up on the track and cannot move. If the trolley continues to kill all 5 of them, you can't stop the trolley, but you can pull a lever, which will divert the trolley to a sidetrack. Unfortunately, there's a man on the sidetrack who will get killed if you pull the lever. So what's the appropriate thing to do here? What's your degree of moral responsibility for the outcome if you do or don't pull the lever, right? So would you feel differently if rather than pulling the lever to get the train to go down the sidetrack and kill 1 person, you got to push a fat man over a bridge? That would stop the train and also kill 1 person. Now, if all you care about is the number of people who die, then the 2 stories are isomorphic, right? In both cases, you're killing 1 person or 1 person will die in order to save 5 people. But people do feel differently about these 2 problems. They feel there's an issue of intention coming in. You have to intentionally push the man. You sort of intended to push him over. So somehow issues of attention come in, and you can sort of think about how you feel about these things, but nevertheless. Very interestingly, last year in Science, the journal Science, there was a modern version of the trolley problem. Should an autonomous vehicle swerve and kill its passenger when otherwise it would kill 5 pedestrians? Now, what was very interesting about this, you can all see this really is the trolley problem, right? What was very interesting about this is people thought it should. So they did. So these people actually did a poll, and most people thought the right thing to do was to swerve so that you kill the passenger and save the 5 pedestrians. So they did what most people did in the trolley problem, kill 1 to save 5. On the other hand, when asked, would you buy an autonomous vehicle that had this as part of its program, most people said they preferred that the autonomous vehicle saved the passenger. I mean, their autonomous vehicle saved the passenger, right? So clearly you feel a little bit differently if it's 5 versus 1 and the 1 isn't you, right? So there's a general agreement that moral responsibility involves causality. You can't be morally responsible for an outcome if your action didn't cause it. There's also agreement that involves some notion of blameworthiness. The extent to which you're responsible for the outcome, we're sort of talking to what extent are you to blame for the outcome? And that in turn involves what you could have done otherwise. If you had no choice in the matter, then you feel differently. And finally, people seem to care about intent. To what extent did the agent want the outcome to happen, or was O an unintended byproduct of A's real goal? So somehow there is this sense that you didn't, if you pull the lever kill one person and save 5 with the trolley problem, you didn't, there's a seat right here, that you didn't intend to kill that one person. What does that mean exactly? So I should say, as an aside, not everyone agrees that intent is relevant, although most people do seem to take it into account. So there's lots of work in psychology where people sort of are asked, to what extent are people, is this an action permissible? And they seem to be getting at issues of intent. All right, let me talk a little bit formally. Don't be frightened. I'll try to keep the math down to a minimum. So I've done a lot of work on causality. And so let me say a few words about causality, because that was, remember, the first point of moral responsibility was causality. So figure it out. Thanks for saving the literature considers 2 flavors of causality. Type causality talks about smoking causes cancer. Statisticians are very concerned about that, or with some probability smoking causes cancer. What philosophers call token or actual causality says the fact that Willard smoked for 30 years is what caused him to get cancer. Now, I focus on token causality, the second flavor. So let me give you a sense of the difference. So suppose I say, look, it's true I was drunk last night. And it's true it was pouring rain. But the reason I had the accident, the cause of the accident, is the faulty brakes, so I'm suing GM. I drive great when I'm drunk. Now, notice here the difference between type causality and token causality. As far as type causality goes, bad weather causes accidents, is a cause of accidents. Drunk driving is certainly a cause of accidents, and faulty brakes are certainly a cause of accidents. So as far as type causality goes, all 3 are causes of accidents. But I want to say in this particular case, which is why I care about actual causality, it wasn't the drunk driving, it wasn't the fact that I was drunk, it wasn't the pouring rain, it was the faulty brakes. Now, the law is very concerned about causality. The law I'm going to claim has a lousy definition of causality. I'm going to try to make that precise. So the basic idea in the formal definition I'm going to give is that A is a cause of B if it involves what are called counterfactuals, things that are counter to fact. So if A hadn't happened, B wouldn't have happened. That seems like a mouthful, but I claim we should be used to that. When I'm saying that it was the faulty brakes that caused the accident, I'm saying if the brakes hadn't been faulty, if A hadn't been the case, then I wouldn't have had the accident. That's what I claim that's what I mean when I say it's the brakes that are the cause. If the brakes hadn't been faulty, I wouldn't have had the accident. And I'm also saying, for example, even if it hadn't rained, I still would have had the accident. The rain is not the cause of the accident, because even if it had been perfectly good weather, it was the brakes, right? And I'm also saying my drunk driving isn't the cause of the accident. What am I saying? I'm saying even if I hadn't been drunk, even if I'd been stone cold sober, I would have had the accident anyway, right? So I claim, if you think about it, we are pretty comfortable thinking about counterfactuals. And the law uses this notion what's called but-for causality in the law. This is the first order approximation how the law defines causality. A is the cause of B. If A hadn't happened, B wouldn't have happened. And it's called but-for causality in the law. Unfortunately, if that was all there was to say about causality, we could knock off several hundred papers and lots and lots of books. Life is more complicated. So here is a standard example. This one comes from philosophy literature. Law literature has even better examples because they're case law. And they're great stories, but let me tell you this example. So Susie and Billy both pick up rocks and throw them at a ball. Susie's rock gets there first, shattering the ball. Both throws are perfectly accurate. Let's assume just that Susie threw a little bit harder, or a few milliseconds earlier, so that's why her rock got there first. But had Susie not thrown the bottle, we'd like to say that Susie's the cause of the bottle shattering. But for causality doesn't work, because had Susie not thrown, the bottle would have shattered anyway. Billy's rock would have hit the ball, right? So but there are lots of cases like this where but-for causality doesn't work. I was invited to this workshop, where I was the token computer scientist, but there were all these philosophers and lawyers, and we got to hear an audio tape of the U.S. Supreme Court discussing a case. And the case involved a heroin dealer who sold heroin to a guy who had congestive heart failure, he was going to die anyway. But because it was bad heroin, he died a little bit sooner. And the question is, was the heroin the cause of death? And you could hear his lawyer say, well, even if he hadn't gotten the heroin, he wanted one last high before he died anyway, right? Don't blame the dealer. He would have died anyway. And you hear in the background Justice Kagan muttering something about this isn't but-for causality, right? But the law doesn't seem to have a good alternative to but-for causality. So there's been lots of work on getting good models of causality, and a fairly influential recent idea, lots of citations of Google Scholar, is using structural equations to model the effect of interventions. I'm not going to go into details, but I do want to give you a little bit of an idea because I need that for my later stuff. So bear with me, it's not as bad as it sounds. So the idea, which is due to Judea Pearl, is that the world is described by a bunch of variables. If you're a statistician, I would say random variables that affect each other. And this effect is modeled by a bunch of equations. That's what are called structural equations. That's where the name comes from. And technically, I want to split the variables into two parts. Don't let the names throw you. There are the exogenous variables. The word exogenous is meant to indicate that they're taken as given. They're determined by factors outside the model. And then there's the endogenous variables, the rest, and they're determined by the exogenous variables and other endogenous variables. So we're going to have equations that describe the values of the endogenous variables, so the ones that aren't taken as given. In terms of the exogenous variables and other variables, we'll have an equation that says x is y plus u. So the value of x, if y is 3 and u is 5, then x is 8. That's what this is saying. The equation is going to be arbitrarily complicated. But the way to think about this isn't really an equality. It's more like an assignment statement in programming languages. So if you somehow were to intervene and set y to 5 and intervene and set u to 3, x would have the value 8. But it doesn't mean if you intervened and set x to 8 that y would be 5 and u would be 3. This is really like an assignment statement that goes this way. The way to think about this is, right, so maybe I'll give you an example. So two arsonists drop lit matches in different parts of a dry forest. Both cause trees to start burning. We can imagine two different scenarios. One says one match is enough to burn down the forest. The other one says you need both matches to get enough of a flame going to get the fire to go. So we can describe these scenarios using what we call a causal network, whose nodes are labeled by variables. Again, don't let this, this is about as much math as you're going to see, but the picture, I think, will help. Think of the U as the exogenous variables. ML1 and ML2 says the first arsonist drops a match. It either has value 0 or 1. Either he drops a match or he doesn't. This is the second arsonist, either drops a match or he doesn't. The U up at the top there, and there are arrows going from U down to these variables, it's determining the values of these variables. What causes them to drop matches? Who knows? Maybe they had upbringing, they liked playing with matches as kids. I mean, that's the exogenous stuff. That determines whether, but then we have the forest burns down, and whether the forest burns down will depend on whether these guys drop matches. Now we have two scenarios. One says that the forest will burn if either one of them drops a match. So the equation there would say the forest burns. This has value either 0 or 1. It has value 1. This is an OR in logic. If either one of these is a 1. So you don't have to know logic. All this equation is saying this is 1 if either of these two is 1. This is an and in logic. But again, this is just saying that the forest burns if both of these guys drop matches. So that's what I mean by we have a model with equations, and the equations will tell us how each variable depends on its predecessors in the graph, right? So that we have two different scenarios, one where it takes one match to get the forest burning down, the other one is where it takes two. The difference between the scenarios is modeled by having different equations for this variable. And in the one case, the equation says one match is enough. If either one of them drops the match, the forest burns. And the other one says you need both matches, right? So the general notion of a structural equations model is a generalization of that. We have a bunch of variables. We think of a graph that describes them. We think of intuitively causality going from the top down. It's acyclic. We actually have definitions that work even if we have cyclicity, but almost all the examples are acyclic. So think of it as being acyclic. Acyclic just says there's no cycles. He's using a technical word. All right. So the arrows, I don't know how well they come out in the back, but they're actually arrows here. And the arrows, think of them as determining the flow of causality. So I'm not going to give you the definition of causality. It's not so simple, but I have a whole talk on causality if anybody cares, which I'll probably give in campus at some point this semester. I have a whole book on this stuff, like a little advertisement there. But so for now, let's assume, I really do, I have a formal definition of causality. And the formal definition will say what it means for A to be a cause of B. Okay? And I went through all of this stuff with the causal models because I'm going to use the causal models to also define other notions. So what I hope became clear in some of the easy examples that I gave at the beginning. So first of all, I should say the definition of causality is relative to a model, to a causal model and a context. The context says, the context describes the values, of the exogenous variables, the ones at the top here. Right, so intuitively, once I know the model will tell me what the equations, the model intuitively tells me how the world works. The values of the exogenous variables tells me what happens to be true about the world now, right? Did the guys actually drop matches or not? Right. So, and the definition of causality is relative to a model. That means, this is for the lawyers, even if you accepted my definition of causality, you're not done yet. Two different lawyers can argue about which one has the better model to describe the world. In one model, A might be a cause of B, in another model, it might not. So the definition of causality, the advantage of having a formal definition is at least if you're discussing something, you know what you're disagreeing about. But the definition of causality does not tell you whether A caused B, it'll just tell you whether A caused B relative to a model. And different people can disagree about what is the best model to describe the world. Does that make some sense? All right, so the reason I say all this is in general, an agent is uncertain. Now, he might be uncertain about both the way the world works. Does smoking really cause cancer? I mean, there was a time when people were arguing that there was a gene that caused you to want to smoke and also caused you to get cancer. So there was this common cause. So people understood that there was a correlation between smoking and getting cancer. But you've heard this all the time. Correlation is not causation. The way that comes out in these causal models is, okay, there would be another variable, your genetic makeup. And your genetic makeup might be such that you really like smoking, something in your genes makes you want to smoke, and also that gene would make you more susceptible to cancer. So even though smoking and cancer are correlated, smoking is not a cause of cancer. Now, you can imagine a different causal model where smoking is a parent of cancer in the graph. Smoking does cause cancer. Now, a priori, you might not know which is the right causal model. You might be uncertain. I mean, at this point, we're quite certain about what the causal model is, but in principle, you might not know. So the agent might be uncertain about what the causal model is. The agent might also be uncertain about the context. In this case, what the context is, well, did the guy actually smoke? I mean, even if we believe that smoking caused cancer, and we see this guy died of cancer, did he smoke? Maybe he had other reasons that he died, right? So there are two sources of uncertainty, and we can imagine an agent has a probability on these pairs mu. So again, M is the causal model that describes how the world works, and U is what I call the context that describes what happens to be true. Which agent dropped a match? Were you in fact drunk? Right? You might be uncertain, even if you understand how the world works. Right? So because of this uncertainty, an agent doesn't know if performing an action will actually cause an outcome. So these models are actually deterministic. If you like, all the probability is not in the model itself, but you're putting a probability on models. It sort of pulled all the uncertainty out, for those of you who worry about these things. So it's not that there is no uncertainty at all, but we're assuming, so if you think about smoking and cancer, well, of course, it's true that some people smoke like chimneys and never get cancer, and other people, hardly puff at all and get cancer. So you might think that the connection between smoking and cancer is probabilistic rather than deterministic. Well, the way we would model that is say, okay, smoking is one of many factors that cause cancer. We might not understand all the factors, but if you smoke and these other factors hold, then you're going to get cancer. And Other people, they smoke, those factors don't hold, they don't get cancer. So we would just model that. We would still have a deterministic model, but we would just stick more in the exogenous variables up at the top. So you smoke, and maybe there's something else in your genetic makeup that makes you particularly susceptible to cancer. Whatever it is, we enrich the model enough so that everything in sight is deterministic, and we have equations that have no probability in sight. And all the probability is, if I say, okay, smoking only, if you smoke, there's a probability of 0.6 that you'll get cancer. Well, that 0.6 becomes the probability that you'll have whatever other factors in addition to smoking are going to give you cancer. So it's sort of transferred all the probability in the model to uncertainty about these other factors. That just makes life a lot easier to move all the probability in one place when you're trying to define these things formally. Let me stop for a second and, how lost are people? I mean, are there questions I can answer? Are we all more or less on the same page? Okay. So let me talk, see, I needed all this stuff to talk about degree of blameworthiness. So, an agent A can compute the effect on outcome O switching from action A, act to act prime. So look, you can switch from one action to another, and the switch made no difference at all as far as the outcome is concerned. Or you can switch, and when you switch, you don't get outcome O anymore. Or maybe with action act, you didn't get O, and once you switch, then you get it, right? So, because the effect of actions is uncertain, right? At the beginning, you have a probability distribution over these causal models. So you perform an action, you'll say, look, I'm going to get this outcome with a probability of 0.7, right? Suppose I did a different action. With what probability would I get the outcome? Again, let me try to make this real. Think in terms of you're driving a car and you're trying to do a tricky maneuver to avoid an accident. Well, you're not necessarily 100% certain that this tricky maneuver will result in you not having the accident, right? So you'll have a probability on how likely will I have the accident if I perform the maneuver? What if I do something else? And what's the probability of having the accident then? So what you're saying is, well, maybe no matter what I did, somebody would have died, right? That's the kind of thing I'm interested in. So you're saying, look, I performed action act, and I'm thinking of switching to action act prime. What's the effect of that going to be on the outcome O that I'm interested in, right? And the effect isn't going to be 0, 1 in general, maybe, but in general you'll say, well, if I perform act, I'll have a certain probability of getting this outcome. If I perform act prime, I'll have a different probability, and I want to look at the difference. I want to look at the net change in the likelihood of the outcome if I switch from act to act prime. Does that make sense? I mean, again, this is not deep math. What you have to think about is, look, if I perform act, I'll get the outcome with probability 0.7. If I switch to act prime, I'll only get it with probability 0.6. So I've made an improvement, but the improvement is only 0.1, right? And so that's what this is saying. What's the difference in the likelihood of the outcome if I switch from act to act prime? Forget about the rest of this.
That's plural stand for probability.
Yeah, the PR stands for probability. Sorry, I mean, I'm so used to, I'm in a world where everybody knows that. But I realize I've just switched to a world where not everybody knows that. So technically, I'm going to define the degree of blameworthiness of your action act for outcome O as the largest net change. So again, don't let the math frighten you. Let me talk about the intuition. You performed a certain action, and you can say, look, to what extent could I have made a difference to this outcome? So I'm thinking about all the other actions I could have performed and say, well, what would have been the best case? How much of a difference could I have made in the best case if I switched from the action I did do, act, or the action I'm contemplating doing, to some other action, act prime? Does that make sense? That's all that the math is saying. It's saying it's the maximum possible difference I could have made to the outcome O by switching from the action I'm contemplating to by switching from that to a different action. The degree of blameworthiness depends on the probability, but to what extent is one of the arsonists to blame for the forest fire? Well, I mean, let's just talk about it. It depends on how likely you might be uncertain about whether it takes one match or two matches or maybe more than two matches to start the fire. So you're going to have a probability on models. right? And you might also suppose you think it only takes one match to start the fire. Now your degree of blameworthiness depends in part on how likely you think it is that the other guy's going to drop the match. If I'm certain Marcus over here is going to drop that match because he loves playing with fires, then my degree of blame goes down to 0. Right? Let me stop and say that slowly. Right? If I'm certain that it only takes one match to start the fire, just about certain, and I'm just about certain that Marcus just loves playing with matches and is going to drop that match, then my action isn't going to make a damn bit of difference. Right? It doesn't matter if I drop the match or not. He's going to drop his match and only takes one to start the fire. Now you might think about this as coming up. What happens if he thinks the same about me? But we're coming. Right? Well, I guess we're here, but that's what the definition is saying. You might not like it, but we'll come back to this point. This is actually an important point. So, actually, let me talk about this now. So this is an issue, this talk, I guess I don't come back to, so I should talk about it. This is actually a big deal that we get. So, have you all heard of the tragedy of the commons, the standard puzzle in economics, right? So, let me give you one version. That there's a bunch of fishermen, and they're told that if they all overfish, then there's not going to be any fish left, and you know they're all going to be hungry next year because the fish population will die out. The right thing for them to do is to just catch a relatively small amount of fish, enough to feed their family, maybe sell a little bit, and if they all do that, the fish stock will perpetuate, and they'll have fish next year and the year after and the year after. Now, each fisherman looks at all his other fishermen and says, no way, these guys are all going to overfish. And at which point it doesn't matter what I do, right? And if they all think that, they have all very low degree of blameworthiness. So now, there's an issue that I think this definition is focused, if you like, on an individual's degree of blameworthiness. It seems to me also important, and we actually do this, I think, in practice, think of sort of a group notion of blameworthiness. What that's saying is, there ain't nobody here but us chickens, right? There's nobody here but us fishermen. So view it as a group. So if you think of the set of all fishermen as a single agent, a super agent in some sense, that super agent has degree of blame 1, because clearly if they'd all not fished or fished, not too much, the fish wouldn't have died out. Likewise, if you think about the arsonists. As a group, the two arsonists between them have degree of blame 1. And it becomes a really interesting question, which this definition isn't dealing with, but I have other definitions that I think will deal with it. I think we think both about the degree of blameworthiness of individuals and about the degree of blameworthiness of groups. You think about sort of ad campaigns that sort of encourage people to think about the environment, every little bit helps, right? Every little bit helps. That, again, they're trying to encourage us to think as members of a group, even though that you as an individual can't make much difference, we as a group can make a big difference. And then it becomes the question, how do you partition, if you like, or how do you distribute the blameworthiness of a group among the individuals who make up the group? Right, so I think that's different from assigning degree of blame to individuals. And I think we tend to think in terms of individuals if we somehow think, it's nature. There's nothing we can do about it. But if we think that as a group we can think differently, that we tend to think of ascribing degree of blame to the group and somehow apportioning it among the individuals. So again, I think this framework will help, but my point is that these are different notions. There's the degree of blame you assign to an individual, where that individual is just thinking on its own and thinking of everybody else's fix. They are the way they are. There's nothing I can do about it. These guys are all going to overfish. Marcus is definitely going to drop the match. From that perspective, I have degree of blame close to 0 because there's nothing I could have done to affect the outcome. But if I think of it as the group, then yes, between us, Marcus and I could certainly have affected the outcome, and then it seems reasonable to somehow apportion the blame that we as a group get among the individuals in the group. So let's take an even more realistic example. Suppose a doctor's use of a drug to treat a patient is to cause the patient's death. That's in fact the case. But the doctor had no idea there would be adverse side effects. So according to his probability distribution, his degree of blameworthiness is extremely low. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing I could have done that would have made a difference, because as far as my beliefs go, this drug has no impact. Now, what do we do in practice? Well, you certainly would have felt differently if there were articles in leading medical journals that said, hey, this drug can have adverse side effects. You probably would have felt even more strongly if there was a little insert inside the drug, right? That said contraindications. If you have, high blood pressure, don't take this drug. Then we would have felt that the doctor committed malpractice, right? And so it's quite clear that so the definition is relative to a probability distribution. The definition itself doesn't tell you which probability distribution to use. Now the law, I'm not a lawyer, so the lawyers here can certainly correct me. My understanding, at least in the US, is that it's a difference between a criminal case or a civil case that in the criminal, so the doctor didn't intend to kill the patient, so as far as criminality goes, he's not criminally liable for the death, but he might be civilly liable for the death because he should have known. So the difference, again, don't quote me on this, but it's clear that people care about the difference between his actual probability distribution, that matters, because did he intend to do it, and the distribution, so to speak, he should have had he been a responsible doctor and read the literature, pulled out the insert and read it. And again, so the definition is silent about which probability to use. It's a mathematical definition. It doesn't tell you which one you ought to use. The definition, you get to plug in the distribution, so to speak. It's a modular definition. It's relative to a probability distribution. And now we can discuss what's the right probability to use. So again, my understanding is in the U.S. they would use both. That for some, for some kinds of criminality, they would use his actual distribution, because that certainly matters to whether he intended to do it. And for a civil, but again, I could be wrong, and I'm not a lawyer. But certainly people do care about what he actually believed, and they also care about what he should have believed had he been a responsible doctor. Again, it would be very different if there was some article in an obscure medical journal that we wouldn't have expected him to read that said, there might be contraindications here. Then he's entitled to believe what he believes. That doesn't seem so bad, right? So again, this definition is relative to a distribution, and it allows you to sort of think about, and it encourages you, if you like, to think about what's the appropriate distribution to plug in. So that's this one. The modeler needs to decide what's the appropriate distribution, and clearly people can disagree about this. So the other point is that the definition of blameworthiness is relative to an outcome. That depending on how you pull the lever, the agent has degree of blameworthiness of 1 for either the death of 5 people or the death of 1 person. You might say it's permissible, so to speak, to pull the lever and only kill 1. This definition says, nevertheless, he's completely, and I think it's the right thing, he is completely to blame for that 1 death, even though we might understand why he did it, right? So the definition is relative to an outcome. It's your degree of blameworthiness for a particular outcome O. And now, what should we do? Well, we certainly evaluate trade-offs using, one way to do it is using what decision theorists call a utility function, where you sort of assign a number to how much you value each outcome. So there I assume that there is a utility function where we evaluate the goodness of outcomes, and that's the standard approach in decision theory. So roughly speaking, I want to say, given a utility function, we take the action that maximizes the agent's expected utility. Now, I don't think this is quite right. That makes me a complete utilitarian. I don't think it's a crazy position, but it basically says I look at acts and I sort of look at each one and say which one maximizes expected utility. That's the one I do, and that's my justification for killing the 1 person, not the 5. And there, I think that's right. I would pull the lever. 1 person would die, and 5 would be saved. And I am taking a somewhat utilitarian position, saying the utility of 5 people living is higher than the utility of saving 5 people is higher than the utility of saving the 1 person. Intention is the hardest notion to define, or at least one that I found hardest to define formally. I last gave this talk, I think it was in early May, and since then our definition of intention, which you're not going to see here in full glory, has changed about 4 times. This is very much a moving target. The same thing happened with causality. Udea Pearl and I gave a definition of causality originally in a 2001 paper. We changed it in response to a counterexample that somebody found. How do you argue you have the right definition? Well, as I say, I'm a mathematician. I'd love to prove a theorem that says, here it is, I got the right definition. And if I only knew what that theorem should say, I think I could prove it. But I have no idea what the theorem should even say. So what happened historically is we had a definition in 2001 that appeared in the conference. The journal version of the paper, which came out in 2005, had a different definition because a student of Pearl's found an example that showed our definition wasn't doing the right thing. We agreed that was bad. We changed the definition. And then I had another paper in 2015 that had, definition mark 3. And I'm not telling you about the 15 definitions that we didn't publish because we found problems in them before we published. And the same thing is happening here. I mean, my co-author Max Kleiman-Wiener and I have had N for a fairly large N definitions of intention, and what I'm going to talk about now is the nth one, because we killed the first N minus 1 because we found problems with them. Am I sure we're not going to find problems with this one? No, I'm not sure. I wish I could prove a theorem that would say, this is the right one, I'm done. If I only knew what that theorem should say, I'd be very happy. If anybody has ideas, I'm happy to talk about it. But the intuition, so all I'm going to talk about here is the intuition and claim, and I do have a paper that talks about this, that it can be formalized in the framework that I've got. So the other thing I want to push is this whole framework of structural equations lets us do these kinds of things. So roughly speaking, I want to say the agent A who performed the action act intended outcome O. If had A been unable to impact O, he wouldn't have performed that. So basically, this is roughly speaking, the definition is a bit more. In the trolley problem, the death of the person that's sidetracked was not intended. You'd have pulled the lever whether or not the guy died, right? That's not, intuitively, that's not why you did the action. You intended that outcome, very roughly speaking, I want to capture the intuition, you intended it if that's why you performed the action, right? Getting that right turns out to be hard, or I found it hard, but these causal models and the agent's utility function, I need utility here to make this precise. Because to talk about intentions, when you would, what does it mean you wouldn't have done it? The way we formalize you wouldn't have done it is your utility would have been higher had you not done it. So that's where the utility comes in. So intention, although I didn't use the utility function to define blameworthiness, that just used the probability as a formal matter, this definition does use utility. Because when I say you wouldn't have done it, it's you would have preferred not doing it had this happened anyway. Right? That's the idea. Let me not go, because we're already past 5 minutes. We need to deal with situations where an agent intends multiple outcomes. So here's some of the subtleties. An assassin plants a bomb intending to kill 2 people. Now I want to say he intended to kill each of those people, but he would have planted it anyway had only one of them died. So if I apply this intuition naively that you wouldn't, you intended to say that you intended outcome O, if O would have happened anyway, you wouldn't have done the action. That doesn't work here. Suppose I intend to kill both Marcus and Al, if Alan dies anyway, I'm still going to plant the bomb because I'm still out to get you. Right? So this naive definition doesn't quite work. We have to be a bit more careful. There has been, especially recently, a fair amount of work on when people view an act as morally acceptable. And this is where we do bring in the utility as well as the probability. Roughly speaking, and I really do want to say roughly speaking, an action is morally acceptable if it maximizes the agent's expected utility and the agent had reasonable probability and utility functions. Think of that as a first cut. So what does reasonable mean? Reasonable means something like the doctor shouldn't believe that this drug has no adverse side effects if there's a journal article that says it does. Reasonable utility function, it's not okay to want to kill your uncle despite the fact that you will inherit millions if your uncle dies. It's just not socially acceptable to go around killing uncles. But that notion of reasonable, speaking as a computer scientist, can take into account computational limitations and emotional state. What I mean by computational limitations, we accept the fact if there are many, many things you can do, you might not notice the best thing to do because it's just hard to figure out what the best thing is to do, right? So that we accept that you're not, it says here it maximizes the agent's expected utility. Well, to maximize expected utility, it might be hard to figure out which action, even if you're willing to accept probabilities and utilities, it might be hard to figure out which action maximizes your expected utility. There's lots of actions out there. This clearly isn't enough to capture people's views because for one thing, people take intention into account. There are computational limitations, so that being able to figure out the best thing to do, we say it's okay you didn't figure out the best thing to do because it was hard to figure it out. But we take into account emotional state that my mother just passed away, I'm really upset, so I do something that maybe isn't the best thing to do, but people sort of can understand why. So this is really not what people do. It's a first cut at what people do, and the question is, how do we capture all these things in the formal definition? Well, I think the framework lets us do it. Let me just conclude with a few points for computer scientists, and I'll throw the floor open to questions. So as a computer scientist, I want to build systems that actually implement some of these ideas. So one thing I'm going to ask is, can you compute the stuff efficiently? And the answer is yes. That it's actually not unreasonable to expect systems to do these calculations. The probabilities can be determined from data. So that part, I think, is the less controversial part for the kinds of applications I have in mind. When you say, where are the probabilities coming from? Well, typically they're going to come from data, right? It's an active research area now, maybe not active enough. How do we, what's an acceptable utility function, right? There are people, Stuart Russell of Berkeley is probably the leader in this area, working what's called the value alignment problem. So the idea is that you're going to try to learn reasonable utilities from data. I don't defend this, I'm just trying to explain what people are doing. So the idea is that intuitively, this robot is just watching people, watching what they do, and assuming these people are trying to maximize expected utility, it understands their probabilities. Can it infer the utilities that they must have had in order for them to be doing what they're doing? Right? So this becomes a machine learning problem of trying to understand people's utilities by watching what they do. This is called inverse. Of course, watching what people do might not reveal real moral behavior. I mean, there's this wonderful story about, which company was it? Microsoft, I think, that released some learning system that was supposed to talk to people and learn to swear really well, because that's what people were doing.
Became a white supremacist.
Yeah, well, it's not clear that people weren't trying to feed it bad data, but yeah.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah,
right?
okay, so I'm not defending this. I'm pointing, look, we are building autonomous systems whether you like it or not. We are building robots that will work in nursing homes. Building autonomous cars is happening. And we can say, these are hard problems, what are we going to do about it? And I completely agree. So think of this as a first cut at trying to, find a framework where we can have a sensible discussion about it. Again, you can disagree with my definitions. I think the framework is actually of structural equations is actually a powerful framework for modeling all of these issues. But again, you might come up with a better framework. But we need to have this discussion, and we need to have it now because these things are happening whether we like it or not, right? So these definitions that I've given don't solve the problem, but at least I think it's useful to have formal frameworks just because it helps make for a better conversation. We can at least agree what we're disagreeing about. You can say, that's a bad utility function to go around killing people. But let's discuss, so what should, at least a framework that sort of lets you plug in a utility function or a set or something that's a preference order, and a framework that lets you plug in probabilities that doesn't tell you what they ought to be. At least then we can sort of disagree. Maybe that's the right place to have the discussion. What's an appropriate utility function or acceptable utility function? You might say, well, the framework isn't building in enough about notions like duty, and it should take into account duty. We should take into account norms in some appropriate sense. And that's okay. So again, I'm not saying that this is the right definition that's done everything. I am saying that we need to have these formal definitions in order to have a sensible discussion. And moreover, we need these kinds of definitions in order to build systems. These are computer systems, they run on algorithms. If we can't agree on a formal framework, then we're going to have trouble building these systems in a way that we think is sensible, right? So that last words here, I presume that H's have a probability in setting, and it's not clear that probability is always the best way to model uncertainty, and it's certainly clear that people don't model uncertainty using precise probability measures. I have a whole other book on that kind of stuff. So as a technical matter, I think it's useful to think about how to modify the definitions I've given to deal with other notions of uncertainty. That's sort of my research path. And likewise about utility, I haven't said anything about what counts as a reasonable or acceptable utility function. I doubt we can get universal agreement on it, but we should try to reach some consensus. We're going to have to reach some kind of consensus because we are building these autonomous cars, right? We can't afford to say, well, leave it to meta-ethicists and they'll, spend the next century discussing it and maybe they'll reach some kind of conclusion. It's too late. We're doing it now, right? And I don't want to leave it to meta-ethicists. I want to say this is a task we all need to be involved in. These are cars that you might be driving, or might be driving you, might be driving your kids, your parents, right? This is something I expect to happen in the fairly near future. Maybe I'm wrong. My crystal ball is somewhat cloudy, but having cars that drive themselves, having assistive agents in nursing homes, this is not a pipe dream, 100 years down the road. This is something that's going to happen. You won't notice it happening because it'll sort of, creep up on you slowly. Your cars will be doing more and more on their own until at one point they're driving themselves, right? And you'll see more and more automation in nursing homes until at one point they're basically, running with like one person, right? The way we've got factories now, we have these factory floors that have robots running around and one person that's supervising, right? All the jobs have gone in the factories. So, this is not the distant future. This is now. Anyway, let me stop there and